Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to our Zero Trust Summit, brought to you by Rubik. The editorial staff of Virtualization and Cloud Review and Redmond magazine have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these two great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's two sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up. During today's third session, we will be giving away a DJI Maverick Air 2 drone, but you must be present to win. So be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have a demo link from our sponsor Rubik available on the console right now. So please download and check those out. It's because of Rubik's underwriting of this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring the summit and supporting the community, and ask you to check out these resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to our first session of today's summit. Zero Trust is hot. Here's what it is and what it's not. The session features Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax. Ian Thornton-Trump, CD, is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. From 1989 to 1992, Ian served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch. In 2002, he joined the CF Military Police Reserves and retired as a public affairs officer in 2013. After a year with the RCMP as criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare. Take it away, Ian.
Hey, thank you so much, everyone. I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to be there. And I kind of threw up my bio slide, as I like to call it, corporate mode engaged. I do a lot of things in the community and really wanted to send a huge shout out to the folks at the CompTIA ASO, really working hard to protect small, medium businesses and MSPs in the United States. And just a couple other highlights, community activism work that I do through the Beer Farmers, run the recording studio here in London, and have an MSP in Canada, and I'm sitting as CISO for Cyjax. So busy guy, but I would like to talk to you today about something that is absolutely been on my mind, and that is the whole concept around zero trust and, what it's not. And I think when I started to approach this topic, I've been pretty passionate about it. Pretty concerned about some of the messaging around it. I feel like we're returning a little bit back to the days of arguments around password length and complexity and whether or not, password managers are a good thing or a bad thing. So zero trust, if we go way back into sort of the beginnings of cybersecurity, coined by Stephen Paul in a doctoral thesis, but really was now sort of like brought into the whole idea of going with the, I would say with the cybersecurity industry and aligning to the needs from explaining what can be a very complex topic and simplifying it into a way of like connecting organizational needs with the needs of IT and IT security, including things like governance, risk, and compliance as well. So that's another factor. Now, this is sort of like a bit of a tongue-in-cheek because, as you guys can imagine, and you're probably inundated as well with the amount of zero trust discussions that are out there and zero trust, dare I say, propaganda from certain organizations. But I guess I found it a little bit disingenuous for Akamai to essentially suggest that zero trust is now about putting in place systems that help safeguard both the employees and the company. I mean, all of a sudden, right? Holy mackerel. So, yeah, I mean, let's really kind of start to dig down into this, and we're going to look at the key pieces of Zero Trust. And I'll give you some insight where I feel in a lot of organizations, Zero Trust might be forcing you to go to a place that's absolute when it comes to cybersecurity, which, as we know, anything in IT is not necessarily absolute, especially once the business adds their demands on top of you. But also where the framework can depart the rails within an organization and cause a lot more friction than you might expect. And so I have been pretty outspoken. And the question was, today, and maybe I'll answer my own question as I go through this, but, can I walk this opinion back at this point? And, so again, these techniques have been around for quite some time, but my contention here is that Zero Trust model, when we look at where it was incorporated, the concepts that we are dealing with today in terms of SaaS and cloud computing are not really ones that we have an incredible comfort level applying a framework from the 70s and then, more widely in the 90s when it became, trust but verify type of model to a model now which is trust nothing. So again, I've been outspoken on this, but I really did approach this from a new perspective of looking for more information that would give me, I think, a more better appreciation of when we say Zero Trust. It may depend on who our audience is. It may really come down to, are we talking to a bunch of technologists or people that are conversant in a technology language, or are we talking to the business? And that whole communication can be very nuanced, and unfortunately, it sometimes can be a very blunt communication. When you say the word trust, there's a lot of baggage that everyone has that brings into those equations. And so this is one of the things that perhaps, Zero Trust brings in things into the conversation that are difficult to discuss, even within your own organization, and we'll talk a little bit about, those types of challenges as well. So one of the things that I think it's fair to really look at Zero Trust is say, when we use something that's somewhat nebulous, and define it somewhat nebulously in terms of language of are we talking to businesses or technologists, we can put out these type of statistics that show an extraordinary compounded annual growth rate for like the Zero Trust security market. But to be fair, when we talk about Zero Trust security market, are we talking about all of the architectural requirements in order to make this work? Are we talking about pure play technology? Are we talking about consultants required and business analysts and project managers to push this framework forward within the confines and boundaries of your organization? So again, yes, does it look like a phenomenal opportunity space? It does. But what is actually under the hood is, I think, what we're going to need to talk about it, right? So Zero Trust in practice, right? 100% visibility, automation, and orchestration. I personally don't think this exists. I think that at best, an organization can get 80, 70% there, because one of the major problems, I think, impeding Zero Trust in practice is the legacy technology stack that many businesses are pulling behind them, okay? And the fact that it is incredibly expensive to re-engineer and rebuild networks using new architecture that can support Zero Trust implementation and give that 100% visibility, automation, and orchestration capabilities. So the first of all, and the general context that I'm going to apply to this sort of next series of slides is let's look at this from an actual practical perspective. Now, one of the biggest problems that businesses live in and that IT live in is the difference not only in conversation and definitions, but it's also a world of grays when it comes to business and a world of absolutes when it comes to IT. It's either on or it's off, right? But when we talk about a framework like Zero Trust, and we're going to try and put that into practice, IT would really like to see it, and so would the security team, as 100% objective. And we know that that's nearly impossible. There's always going to be compounding factors, legacy technology, and a number of other areas that we're going to get into and we're going to talk about as we move through the deck. So in the perfect world, again, for Zero Trust, one of the foundational pieces of Zero Trust is, of course, identity management, IDAM. IDAM has proven to be very important to protect your cloud things, and I've done a number of Redmond channel partner webinars on cloud protection on both the AWS and the Azure stack. And what we know, quite simply, is that multi-factor plus single sign-on is really the desired state in order to control access to resources that are located on-premise and, of course, in the cloud, right? So we get to that imperfect world where there may be applications, internal or external to your organization, that have their own sets of user IDs and passwords along with different requirements. In fact, I can tell you from my ancient past that working for a large financial services organization, there was a system that could not support more than an 8-character password because of the operating system that system ran on, and that system once a month generated revenue to the tune of $1 million by having to update a bunch of policy documents with new calculations. Okay, so again, here's an example where there's a bit of a chink in the armor that in true Zero Trust practice, we would love to have everything protected by multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. And I'll get to why single sign-on becomes so important as part of your strategy to get to Zero Trust. And therefore, this now drives out a policy around identity management in third-party applications as a requirement. So now what we're talking about, okay, is we have gone beyond the pale here of talking simply about Zero Trust as IT, Zero Trust as security. We're now talking about Zero Trust as a requirement for procurement. Now, what your procurement team and your PMO office and even your corporate counsels, depending on the nature of the a transaction and how involved they're going to get, they're going to have a fundamentally different understanding of asking a company to provide evidence of Zero Trust, and the company will be like, well, what are you talking about? Versus what a set of IT requirements is going to be in order for you to meet your goal of having this Zero Trust architecture in place or framework, okay? So keep in mind that many of these things are going to either be, again, in the identity world, legacy issues, right, with the technology that can't actually support any sort of Zero Trust framework or architecture, including, this is in the OT world as well with hard-coded credentials in certain devices, especially if you have any sort of large-scale printing or manufacturing operation. You may find that the entire OT network will just not be moved towards that framework because of constraints on the technology. And so in the imperfect world that we live in, there might be parts of it that are somewhat elusive without a massive expense, again, in order to get there. Now, endpoints. Again, in the perfect world, everything is up to date, which we know is a lie. And we know that, when doing vulnerability management, there are some things that even though you really wished you could have it completely up to date in all categories, if you did, that could break applications and or cause unanticipated downtime and or compliance violations. There are a number of plugins and a number of pieces of software that the business needs in order to conduct transactions. You are sometimes one .NET security update away, or one WordPress or Drupal update away from breaking a critical resource within your organization. So in some cases, despite the idea of having this endpoint hygiene that quarantines or suspends that asset's participation in the network, you now sometimes have to accept the risk in the real world, and nothing illustrates that more than the challenges from work from home. Because work from home is an untrusted corporate network that is now, in one form or another, connected to the corporate network via a VPN solution and or via even a remote desktop, okay? So there is a hygiene issue when you think about zero trust from an endpoint perspective, and also, again, cloud services. There are certain tools and technologies that you can deploy on your own environment, in your own tech stack, but you will not be able to implement those technologies in a cloud services environment or third-party boxes. So for instance, the building management system box that you have, or any of the IoT devices, they may not support that multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, Active Directory integration that you would need in order to have that, perfect zero trust solution. So far on this journey, I hope I've showed a few of the use cases where the aspirational goal of zero trust is not a practical approach to take from a financial perspective or business function, and we haven't even gotten to the rest of the things I want to talk about either. So, the perfect world, we know exactly where all our data is. No, you don't. Most of the experiences I've had with data management come in and are just sort of a terrible experience to go through. And this is because in many large companies, there may not even be a data classification and retention policy. The company has compiled a ton of data, and their approach to data management has been to move it from server to server to server as they upgrade it. I mean, back in the day, we used to see copy of access access databases and Excel spreadsheets. So, we've all been there. And in the imperfect world, we know where some of our data is, but it might be, especially if it's in a SaaS application, not nearly as secured as we would need it to be to get to that zero trust in practice standard that we would love to have. And the other issue, too, is that when we work with data and we interact with data, one way or another, in a lot of cases, it ends up on the endpoint. So it could be as a result of installing, the Dropbox client or the Microsoft OneDrive client. So we do have replica data of important data on endpoints. So there's a certain requirement for hygiene there. But also, when we're working with third parties, in a lot of cases, they'll ask us to zip up a database of stuff for them to look at or debug or find out what the problem is in a corrupt database. Insert any jokes about SQL or Exchange as you like on that particular topic. So we know that copies of data, be it part of a business function, such as you're outsourcing your marketing, and so you're sending an email marketing list to a third-party marketing company, or copies of your internal data where it's actually gone onto endpoints, even though you would like it more so in a secured state and an auditable state, and a state that you can apply principles of zero trust and have a clear audit trail of that data. And so data management now becomes something that is a bit outside the house of IT and IT security, because again, in those conversations, and we talk about this all the time, you have data as sort of an entity, right, that we tell the business they own the data. Okay, fair enough. We're the custodial staff for it, right? But then we end up in the roles of advising them in terms of data management because we have constraints with our systems. Backup is taking too long. The records are now out of date and need to be expunged under a data retention regulatory action. So as much as we'd love to put data and data management on the business's shoulders, this now requires cooperation. And in order to meet business functions, you can't actually just sit there and restrict that data from not being able to move from the place that it's put, because you will get a phone call fairly quickly from an angry vice president, and then things will spiral downwards completely. Now, this one is the biggie one. And to be fair, this is where I think a lot of organizations are struggling with as they look towards the perfect world of their software development lifecycle process. Okay? Now, this is a classic sort of snake eating the tail problem, because in a lot of organizations, you've had a long road of software device lifecycle management processes in place. So let's take as an example of Microsoft. That's probably a really good one that is struggling a little bit from the latest version of their most secure operating system ever. Okay, there is legacy code put into those operating systems in order to support legacy applications. It's highly likely that that legacy code will have some sort of potential vulnerability if it's exposed to an attacker or reverse engineered. So therefore, in many cases, application development lifecycle is a cumulative process in the organization and may not apply to things done previously. Okay, so I always like to say you're one pen test or one ransomware incident from having your true state of your security of your web development platforms that are exposed to the internet from being shown to you rather graphically at usually an inconvenient time. All right, so this is one where you're only as good as the applications that you're using, the applications that you're developing in terms of your zero trust in practice. Well, that's not really anything that you can truly trust. And so we're sort of victims of our own way forward when it comes to the understanding of the vulnerabilities inherent in the application stack versus the actual software that we use. And I'm not even talking about the entire stack here of hypervisor, of firmware, of the, you can call it sort of a quasi rendering or presentation layer in terms of content management system, to the actual code that is running on your application. So if you're controlling all of those things and you have the budget to do so and the resources to do so, you can probably achieve a pretty high level of zero trust architecture. But many of these risks in our applications, because we don't make operating systems generally, you're now going to have to inherit some untrustworthy components in order to still deliver the business objective. So again, this now goes into the idea that, hey, we need a mechanism to make sure that we don't have critical and high vulnerabilities pushed into production on external-facing interfaces, which could put a solid business risk in front of the business. So there are things that we can do to get close to this, but there are many, many things that we're dragging along, from legacy code to code that was poorly written but has a necessary business function. And again, this is what you're weighing for, and this is why I think a lot of organizations just need to be patient with themselves as they slowly move towards that architecture where you can actually apply principles of zero trust. Because I think in the application stack, if I see PHP, if I see C++, if I see older languages, I pretty much know that they're under modern scrutiny with modern attack tools, they would possibly succumb. And I think that's a really important understanding to take within your organization, and that there will be levels of risk present in application development that just cannot be mitigated. Even though you might go out and buy something expensive to do it, but you can get there with things like a robust software bill of materials and code scanning and proper approach to threat modeling. But, when you see all of this stuff that is required to sort of achieve this nirvana, it may not be commercially viable for your organization to do it. Which then brings us into the infrastructure question, where I think, to be fair, this is another one that has almost this equal challenge when it comes to application development. At the very end of this thing, there is some farmer with a tractor dragging away a Russian missile launcher. No, there is some farmer with a backhoe that is digging up your infrastructure. The actual physical fiber that connects you to the rest of the world. Infrastructure fails. It's impossible at anything outside of your sphere. So what I'm talking about outside, step 10 meters away or 10 feet away from your building, and that's beyond your control in terms of zero trust. So that the reality here is that the infrastructure that you are running your business on is going to be inherently untrustworthy, and you actually need a totally different strategy that looks at resiliency rather than the zero trust, because that now is where we have the little chat notification that resiliency has entered the conversation when it comes to infrastructure. Also, we can't always trust the platform, especially in multi-tenancy scenarios, as well. So all of that infrastructure, not just the physical infrastructure of layer one, but all the way up to where you're actually potentially installing and configuring something is kind of unknown. And even though in the terms and conditions and indemnification process that you go under when you buy an actual service, you're going to, I would say, struggle a little bit in terms of really locking this down into the zero trust framework. And a big part of your risk is going to be based on, unfortunately, something that somebody else is responsible for. And there's only so much, I would say, governance, risk governance, and compliance that can be applied to that. So again, you're going to fall short if you're looking for 100% zero trust on the infrastructure side. And then finally, of course, there's the network. The Network Operations Center should know all the things, but in practice, it may be largely disconnected from the business itself. Now, obviously, when there's a physical change, such as a merger and acquisition, a divestment, a new application being brought online, the NOC has to be brought up to speed. But sometimes there's a breakdown. And this happens a lot with the security teams because, as we know, one of the things we really do struggle with is asset management. What is actually on the cable? What it is actually doing there? What components is it running? And in some cases, what data does it have and who owns that data are some of the toughest problems in information security today that are there. And then, of course, the next layer of complexity is once we know all that, what do we do about it, right? Because, we're living in a world right now that even, I would say, larger businesses to enterprise businesses literally have thousands of firewalls in terms of like rule sets for those firewalls. And so in a lot of cases, because of poor management on the network stack side, those interfaces and or ports that have been opened to the internet randomly, statistically, could have something that's vulnerable plugged into it by accident. So it's not so much, do I need to know 100% of everything that I have in terms of an internal and attack surface? Again, 100% is what's going to degrade the idea of 100% zero trust in the actual network that you're operating on. at best, even with some of the heaviest duty investments into asset management at the enterprise level, I think 85 or 90% is going to be a top mark, because there's simply too many dynamic things, levers, goings, offices coming online, offices going offline, et cetera, to truly be able to get a 100% accurate picture to implement 100% of anything. When you look at reports that are coming out of your SOC on the overall coverage of your organization in terms of vulnerability management, or in terms of antivirus being updated, 85 to 90, it's like top F1 tier performance of a team. And I know of several global companies that are struggling with this and have extraordinary investments made in that technology as well. So what is this? So conceptually, and as a security framework, okay, it may be very expensive to address the imperfect world we live in. We live our day-to-day IT lives to get to that perfect world, right? So I love West Wing. I've always been a fan of it. I think it's some of the nicest and tightest writing that's out there. And there was a really great quote, post hoc ergo propter hoc, after it, therefore, because of it, right? Explained another way, one thing follows the other, therefore it was caused by the other. So this is, in my mind, the acceptable risk statement for conceptually moving towards zero trust as a security framework. That as you improve in all the different areas that I outlined in terms of like the visibility, the automation, the orchestration, the understanding what was in your sphere of being able to control and where your acceptable risk has to be when you're dealing with third parties, you can move the security ball forward, but you can't do it in a rapid and a difficult manner. So I guess my caution is that when you hear the words zero trust, look underneath and find out what key components of zero trust this solution is providing, instead of just thinking, and this happens a lot at the business level, where a senior executive in the sales or marketing team or accountancy team picks up a magazine, 600 pages on zero trust, and then the next morning they're in front of the CIO and the CISO saying, I want this zero trust thing. I've heard good things about it. I have some budget to spend on getting us zero trust. And that's where it falls apart. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't communicate. You didn't make a mistake where you're being dragged into this office to talk now about zero trust. You're now being called on the carpet to say, we need this thing. I've heard good things about it, and it will save our business from being hacked. And unfortunately, for many executives that have to put their foot into the IT and CISO world, they need to be able to speak truth to power at that moment and say, we are months, years away from doing this, and it may be extraordinarily expensive because there are some things beyond our sphere of interest. However, as we move this ball forward, we can get to that point where we are comfortable enough to say we have a zero trust framework when it comes to net new. We have a zero trust framework when it comes to remediation of existing, and we have adopted a zero trust framework to lifecycle manage the things that can't even be brought to any sort of semblance of zero trust, right? So now what have I done? I've expanded your mind and shown you that the challenges of zero trust are at the organizational level, and it requires a lot of support from executives to understand not only their own landscape and the areas and solutions that they need from the marketplace in order to potentially achieve some semblance of trust. But there is a trap, okay? And now, the last few slides that I have to present on here, guys, this is where it potentially falls. The straight corridor suddenly becomes a drop shaft with spikes at the bottom of it, okay? So this is all about listening skills and understanding that dialogue and that communication breakdown that executives are going to have with IT operations and IT SOC people and all of the button pushers and lever pullers that work. A framework is a support or structure or system that holds the parts together and has something stretched over it that acts as the main structure, right? So simply going out and buying the latest EDR solution does not deploy zero trust across your organization. It is one key component focused on endpoint and maybe yes network that will help you on that journey. But it's not going to solve your legacy application problems or fix your identity access and management. The problem with zero trust, and I tried to articulate this quite simply, is if it becomes a philosophy, then there is in danger of becoming a attitude that IT will take or security will take towards any agility and any solutions. Because let's go back to the roots and talk about this. This was an idea formulated in the 1970s, then brought forward into the beginnings of discussions around cybersecurity. It never conceptualized the ideas of cloud computing. It did not conceptualize the level of diversity and growth in application development and legacy code and legacy hardware that we've hauled all the way forward, right? We were at the infancy of computing when this concept arrived and was suggested as a framework. The problem of taking a framework and it becoming a philosophy is that it is essentially the equivalent of that great wisdom and advice that you can get by getting rid of all your worldly possessions. And then you can achieve a sense of nirvana. But in the practical, real world, you probably have a mortgage to pay, an extraordinary petrol bill, an electrical bill to pay. So what I'm telling you is zero trust cannot be a philosophy. It falls apart and it becomes a trap for those conversations that you have with the actual business. And hostility, when you fall into a trap, your natural reaction is to be hostile about it. And this is where things go sideways. If it's difficult because of your zero trust implication for the business to do work, you will soon find that the business will become hostile about that, and that could end up, well, let's just put it nicely, you putting up your flag on your LinkedIn profile looking for your next opportunity, right? So what's the solution? How do we let this amazing idea of a framework and what appears to be an IT lifecycle roadmap handed to us that tells us that if we apply this framework to our IT, that we can achieve a level of visibility and a level of all that great stuff that comes along with it, like orchestration, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is, it's two razors, not just one razor, that really make a difference. And, you know, to echo my points about a hostile environment, the hostility from the organization becomes when there's two diametrically opposed forces. That is, the IT and the IT infrastructure and everyone else that's just trying to get work done so that they can make their numbers, okay? So again, that level of paranoia that was present in the Battlestar Galactica series and the hostilities and suspicions that arose when, you know, not to spoil it for you, but when Cylons could be humans, became a key level of discomfort within that organization. So how do we fix that? With razors, two of them. So this is my approach to making sure that you live in a realm of the possibility and practicality of zero trust and not simply swallow it as a philosophy and then try to use it and leverage it in order to not make any forward momentum within the organization and become a hostile blocker. The first is, of course, Howland's razor, the two competing theories. The simpler explanation of an entity is to be preferred. What that means is if there are two things that you think are out there, the simpler one will quite possibly be the easier and the most likely to be successful in that endeavor, okay? So again, when you're looking at your journey to zero trust, You can heat map it out. You can use any techniques that you want to really go deep down and look at, what are the weaknesses? What does the framework sort of suggest that we do about these type of issues that we have? And you can look at the marketplace to find something simple, maybe even an open source tool, maybe even a change to some of the existing onboarding or offboarding policies or extensions of existing capabilities that you haven't leveraged yet, okay? So again, am I talking about Zero Trust at the network layer and saying, yes, you should roll out 802.1x and you should have network authentication or network access control across your entire organization? The amount of work and effort that will take you to implement, and time and effort, only to find out that many IoT devices can't support it, and you're actually back to square one anyway with total network access control, it's extraordinarily expensive, it's extraordinarily complex, right? So the better solution would be find something easier to do. And then finally, when you're talking about Zero Trust and the human being, where something bad happens and the executive is saying, but I thought we had Zero Trust, like it's some sort of magical solution to anything bad that would ever happen into the organization, right? Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity, okay? So asking you to secure something on Windows 2008 with no budget is probably a task that is a stupid task, okay? But the business got scared. Somebody in governance and risk or an auditor or a third party, an influential third party said that this is a problem and that you need to secure it somehow with no money and no resources. Right. So at that particular point, you need to take a deep breath. Understand that this bizarre request wasn't made with malice. There is a reason for it. You may not agree with that reason, but it can be explained by stupidity that the best way to secure a 2008 box is to find what it does, what data it has, and move it to a more modern operating system so you don't have all of those vulnerabilities, all right? There's a huge time saving involved that you can say about that and say, well, we have this thing, don't know much about it, I got to look at it, we now got to study it, we now got to look at what solutions are out in the marketplace that support Windows 2008. We got to make sure that the code is going to run, we're going to need a proof of concept, right? There's so much work that's going to be required for just that one simple task. And again, don't go to the place or don't think it was a malicious task that you're being assigned with. There is a reason for it. So try and find that reason. And yes, that reason can be stupid, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can't be creative in trying to fix that particular problem, right? And so, again, you've gone down this road. You've looked at Zero Trust from a whole bunch of different perspectives. The organization itself is dynamic, okay? And this is where we now talk about organization's agility. It has to respond to, currently there's a fisticuff going on between the Ukrainian and the Russians, pretty serious one. I believe it's called war. This is a dynamic thing that is going to happen to organizations. Just before this, I was having a background chat I was just at a meeting about the distributor supply chain and how product is really difficult to get, especially popular product that's selling out at the distributor level incredibly quickly. There's back orders all over the place. We live in a chaotic, ever-changing world. We live in a dynamic world where the forces of business, the forces that we encounter, the pandemic, global climate change, you name it, are going to have some sort of impact on all of the facets of your organization. And this is, me screaming in the dark when I hear a Zoom call where the organization is saying, hey, we're going to complete an M&A deal with this company that, nobody got the heads up about. It was announced through the PR release, and, you were the guy that found it, because you were the only guy in your company that had a Google alert set up on your affiliates. And you find out that there's this major business thing going on, and you've just been through the ringer. You've moved the bar forward, in achieving, a level of zero trust, only to now have it undone by those chaotic forces that are, again, beyond your control. So the question is, and I made a little joke about all the people that leave the conversation when announcements like this and that, is this. Don't be discouraged about this situation. Look at it as yet another opportunity to gain skills, gain training, gain vital skills that later on in your life will help you come into a company and chart a course for better cybersecurity. Because at the end of the day, zero trust is just a name for more effective, better security for your organization and people. I am Ian Thornton-Trump. I want to thank our sponsors, Rubik, and of course, my folks at Redmond Channel Partners who always look after me on that. And I hope you enjoyed my tirade.
Hey, and I think we all enjoyed your tirade. Super entertaining. You got some time for some questions?
100%. Bring it.
All right. Nice. Let's start off with a question from Vishal. You gave a lot of examples of zero trust in Windows environments. What does that kind of look like for open source OSs?
So, that has been a huge discussion, especially in light of Log4j, right, and now Spring for Shell type of scenarios. So I'm going to go on the record here. I'm not going to suggest for a moment that Microsoft environment is more secure than OpenSoft or open software. It comes down to the skill of your development. What I would say is that if you can get training for your software development team for coding securely, if you can put in the tools at Q&A to OWASP 10, to make sure that none of the code that you're writing is susceptible to any of the OWASP 10, scanning it before it goes into production in the development environment so that you have code integrity and a DevOps function. All of this stuff contributes to the overall goal of zero trust in practice. And again, there's not really a huge difference between open source, but open source has one huge advantage in getting to a secure implementation. And that's actually because unlike the Windows operating system environments where you're talking about Windows servers, the attack surfaces of Linux boxes or open source boxes can be reduced substantially, right? So like, for instance, they don't print unless you install the printer daemon, right? Unfortunately, with Windows servers, the Windows Server service is on by default, unless you're going in to harden those boxes. So again, when you look at kind of go through this thing, that orchestrated build capability using things like Puppet become like huge game winners for advancing that zero trust architecture or framework, zero trust framework in the organization. But it comes down to the vulnerability of the code that's running on the platform, and you can put in so many great tools in the open source world and commercially to make sure none of that code gets to the point where it becomes a vulnerability. And this is why one of the points I made, you absolutely need to know all of the components that go in. The cool kids are calling it the SBOM. The SBOM, or software bill of materials as it's called, is a complete listing of all the libraries or dynamic link libraries in the Windows world, all the libraries you're using. All of those things will make the vulnerability management, the identification of an actual threat from a threat actor that's exploiting that vulnerability massively easier. And so there is a thing that zero trust doesn't really talk about, but that is, as I said, business resiliency. So when confronted by this existential threat, because you're an open source shop and you have Log4j and it is exposed, and you need to remediate that right away, you have other layers. Don't lose your mind. You have a web application firewall in front of it. You have a content delivery network in front of it. You can put in the next generation firewall that will protect it from exploits. You might even have a SIEM or SIM that can identify exploits that may be able to expose that vulnerability. You might even be blocking the hostile LDAP exfiltration from your infrastructure back to the LDAP server, the hostile malicious LDAP server that was used in order to leverage Log4j. So the answer is the architecture, the knowing what you're putting into it, the locking it down and hardening as a continuous cycle, right? Zero Trust doesn't mean you throw out ISO 27001. Zero Trust doesn't mean you don't do the best practices. What Zero Trust is trying to portray to you is that there's an approach of putting in your defenses in such a fashion that you can maximize the security value. And that's what I think we're trying to get to.
Okay, great. Next up, we have Christian from my hometown of Portland with a couple of tool-related questions for you. First one is, what tools can be used to monitor APIs and integration of microservices?
So I'm not an expert at that level at all, Christian, so I will just talk about this broadly, and I can certainly send you to some of my friends with the beer farmers that work in the AppSec world, Sean Wright Sec. You can look him up. He's got a blog. He talks a lot about those types of stuff. But what I will say is this type of layered approach where the API is wrapped in a security mechanism, where you've restricted access to that API, where you're using robust encryption. In terms of SBOM, Sean did a presentation just last week at Edinburgh at NESEC. And in that presentation, he did a demo of Spring for Shell. He's brilliant. But he did name half a dozen tools that I should have been paying better attention to that will help you on that journey as well. I do know, I think it was called, no, it's escaping me again. But I do know that large, expensive commercial tools like checkmarks and others that are used to find vulnerability in code can also do a inventory of what code is actually being used. There was, it's on the tip of my tongue. Sorry, I couldn't do better on that one for you, Christian.
We'll give you a pass on that. Let's move on to our next question. You said a help desk with a robust IDAM process is a key component, but the help desk is rarely under the control of IT security. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
100%. So, policy says, we're going to confirm identities for passive resets or new stuff. The standard operating procedure for that function should be owned by the security team. Okay? So what I'm talking about here is this is where, the callback, the verification, the give me your employee number, can you confirm, the last few digits of your phone extension? Okay, I'll phone you back. I've issued you a web link, to reset your password, et cetera, et cetera. All of those standard operating procedures need to be owned by security. They need to be reviewed, in some cases every 6 months or a year, especially if you're in a dynamic environment and you've got different identity and access management systems. I pity you already. But all of those things, the process procedure needs to be owned by the security department and executed by the help desk. With a clear explanation path. Yeah, sorry, I wanted to add that part.
Oh yeah, no problem. I think we got time for a question or two more.
Sure.
Here's a great one that probably a lot of us are feeling right about now. I'm in a busy IT shop processing more than 500 tickets a week. I'm afraid Zero Trust will degrade our close rate stats and SLA. Can you provide some insight?
That sounds like a very help desk centered. I manage a help desk. My life is not the question. Again, this goes back to processes and procedures, of course. But this is that business conversation that you need to have. Is the journey to Zero Trust and more robust security for the organization worth the bits of inconvenience that are going to happen along the way, right? And so, yes, it may actually degrade your performance, which is going to suck. But if you've had the conversation with the business and you're explaining that now we have to do a callback in order to verify somebody's identity because we need to confirm that their phone is the correct number so that we can't get somebody's 2FA code on the wrong phone, thus giving the bad guys access. You have to come to the table with realistic explanations where these extra steps are going to impact business operations. I'm not going to sit there and tell you, yeah, fine, go for it, it'll be fine. It won't be fine. It'll be rough. And especially the few times where you might have folks that have been doing that role for years, and now you're asking them to change a process or procedure. That in itself can be tough. But I'm going to say we need to up our security game. Organizations absolutely need to take this stuff seriously, because the last bunch of group that made a mess, Lapises, weren't using sophisticated zero-day hacking attacks. They were leveraging their ability to social engineer staff in order to gain access and then steal data. So as a help desk, you're really at the tip of the spear, and this is where you reach out to the IT security department. If you don't have a security department, get a security consultant to help you with this type of thing, of setting up those standard operating procedures that, yes, it will probably take you longer, but it will get you now to that place where you're comfortable and the organization is comfortable trading off a little bit of extra time or inconvenience for the security benefit. Yeah.
All right. Great. I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thanks again, Ian, for the super insightful and entertaining talk.
Thanks. I appreciate it. And always my pleasure. And I'm looking forward to listening to the next one for sure. I'll be there on listen-only mode.
Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you very much for your patience, and welcome back to our Zero Trust Virtual Summit. My name is Leif Lowe, and I'll be your moderator for this second and final session today. This session is entitled Zero Trust Best Practices, What Enterprise IT Needs to Know About Implementation. And this entire event is sponsored by Rubrik. Well, we heard a great overview of what Zero Trust is and what it isn't, a thorough explanation of what it means. And while Zero Trust can certainly be a major factor in ensuring protection of your organization's infrastructure and data, it's critical to deploy and implement it thoroughly and accurately. Zero Trust deployments typically follow a multi-step methodology. First of all, you want to identify the users and devices that will be involved and included. Then you need to establish access controls and some sort of microsegmentation. And then this is a critical step. You want to deploy continuous network monitoring. You definitely need to keep an eye on what's going on. And it's probably also a good idea to consider remote access when implementing your Zero Trust policies and procedures. Whatever other steps you may opt to take, implementing Zero Trust can help you protect your network and adapt to the continuously fluctuating modern enterprise environment. With Zero Trust, you'll be operating by never trust, always verify. It's a good way to be. Well, during the second session today, we'll be examining some of the critical steps and preparations you'll need to take to properly implement Zero Trust. Our featured speaker today is John O'Neill, Sr. John is the Chief Technologist for AWS Solutions. During his more than 20 years in IT, John has worked as a consultant, architect, executive, speaker, and author. He's been involved in numerous multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He's authored material for Thomson Reuters Aspitor books and exec blueprints, and also develops courseware for Pluralsight. John is a frequent speaker at IT events such as TechMentor, Cloud and Virtualization, Live 360, the NEOSA CIO Summit, and the Northeast Ohio Technology Summit. He's been honored as a multi-year Microsoft MVP and has also received NEOSA's CIO of the Year Award. And I also like to add that he is a PADI-certified IDC staff scuba diving instructor. Great to have you back, John. Always a pleasure.
Great to be here, Leif. I'm always excited when we can get together and dive into these tech subjects.
Yeah, gotta have the diving button in there for sure. All right. Now, before we get into this final session, I just want to remind all of you of a few housekeeping items. If you would like to submit a question at any time, which we strongly encourage you to do, you can post your question in the question field to the left of the slide window. type your question in there and hit submit. We'll get to as many of those as we can before at the end of the session. And once again, this entire summit is being recorded, so you'll have an opportunity to review it again or even pass along to share with a colleague. Okay, John, let's begin our exploration of how to best implement Zero Trust to help protect your organization. Time to dive in.
Let's use it.
All right. Now, to lead off, what should enterprise IT do to best prepare to implement Zero Trust? What are some of the first steps they need to take?
So, talking about this particular topic, Leif, I often get some raised eyebrows in the room because I start off a little bit differently than a number of other people, and that's all right.
Yeah.
The way that I start off is I believe that success or failure around any Zero Trust implementation hinges upon the cohesiveness of the team and the effort, the buy-in from the stakeholders, the understanding of the IT group. It's all necessary to make this happen, because when we talk about Zero Trust, we're talking about a methodology that often runs contrary to the experiences that most users have had in the past, right? Using computer systems and IT systems, the processes involved in getting access to things and all that. I mean, conventionally, most users, most organizational stakeholders, whether it be business leaders or, the C-suite executives or your board of directors, whatever, they've always looked at, hey, we should err on the side of convenience and capability for our users to serve customers rather than the approach we need to take with Zero Trust, which is we always err on the side of caution and security.
Yeah.
And so building that cohesive understanding and that unified vision, I believe, is the necessary first step to guaranteeing you have, the best chance of success. When people are marching to different drummers, the song never turns out right. And one thing that I start when I talk to the stakeholders to bring them on board is to let them know that Zero Trust principles and architectures aren't designed to hinder collaboration and capability and convenience. They're designed to protect the organization and the user and the customer, the stakeholder, and through that protection, guaranteeing that systems are up and running and there when you need them. So in a way, Zero Trust is all about ensuring that capability stays there and that people don't lose access and that orders don't get filled, right? Zero Trust is all about empowering the business to keep operating. And so this is not something we're doing in an IT vacuum. This is something we're doing to protect the business and the individuals, right? Because if you think about the individuals and we talk about malware and ransomware and things like that, we're talking about things that could directly impact their paycheck, their employment, all these types of things. If an organization is taken offline for weeks and months, odds are there are some people that are going to get some unpaid time off during that time.
Yeah.
So we're really trying to protect them and keep them, earning that paycheck 40 hours a week and that sort of thing. And so that's the way I sell that. And then the other part of it that we need to take a moment and look at is the IT part of it. And what I found is a lot of the professionals in the IT groups that we work with, so our peers, our coworkers, our consultants, whatever, they have a different understanding of what Zero Trust means and should look like and how it should be implemented. And this, even if they've gone out and they've read, the NIST documents on what Zero Trust is, they've attended webinars, seminars like this one to understand it, they still come away with a perspective that sometimes differs from others because it's skewed to their current business environment and their experiences or whatever. Say I've been working for the same company in their IT group for 20 years. Well, I have a pretty robust understanding of how that company has leveraged IT and needs to leverage IT and all that. And that can cause me to think differently about zero trust. So I need to get the entire IT group together and have that talk and let everybody bring out what their understanding is and get everybody on board with, no, when we say zero trust, we don't want to skew it. We want to talk about exactly what the principles mean and what our goals are and how we're going to protect.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes sense. That's a good philosophy. Good philosophy. I like that. Get everyone involved and everyone online for sure. In line, rather.
Right. And then we're all we only have one drummer playing one beat that we can march to.
Yep. Perfect. I like it. All right. Once they get rolling with zero trust, once it's up and running, if you will, what are some of the fundamental aspects of a zero trust policy? How does that fit within the enterprise workflow?
Well, so this is a good one, because if we go back to what I was talking about, how we get the business to align, or the organization to align with our thoughts on implementing zero trust and why we need it and that sort of thing. What we really need to look at is that zero trust is a way for us to do exactly what I said, to protect the organization and keep it operating. Yep. And make sure that we're protected agilely, because the threats that we have today are not the ones we had yesterday. I mean, for the first time in our history, we're at cyber war. Yeah. Cybersecurity, even 6 months ago, was all pretty much based around the concept of, okay, attacks are based on either, espionage or monetary gain, things like that. Never before have we actually gone to a place where we're like, no, we have nation-state sponsored attacks that want to do nothing other than hurt. Mm-hmm. Right? They're not so interested in the conventional outcomes of infecting us or attacking us. They want the effectiveness of a bomb. Mm-hmm. And that means that they're willing to accept a whole lot of collateral damage. And we got to be able to agilely adjust and move to that. And that's what zero trust empowers us to do. So, when we first look at the workflow of that and how that's gonna play out in our organization and that kind of thing, I always kind of like to start by saying, hey, let's look at how NIST tells us to start. And so the NIST document, I think, is 800-207, if I remember correctly. And it kind of tells us that, right, we have to make sure that we're never assuming validity of any access to our devices or our network. We're constantly validating that any access on our network, whether it be from an interactive user or from a service or application, that it is continuously validated. Mm-hmm. And being actively permitted to participate on the network, right? There's no passive participation. We're not just saying, oh, well, if you're inside the network, you're free to go and do whatever you want. We're saying, right, you may have gotten authenticated an hour ago, but, things change over the course of an hour. Yeah. And so our systems have to be set up for that. And, that can be kind of challenging, particularly when you consider that a lot of vendors have started to come out with their own twists on zero trust. Remember I talked about how the IT pros and we have to get them all having a cohesive vision. Well, that's made more complex by the fact that an IT pro that's dealing with one vendor may get a perspective of zero trust that is skewed by that vendor. And of course, probably because they're trying to sell us something that they think is better than their competitors or that kind of thing. And really what we're trying to do is just take that basic definition of zero trust that says there is no network edge. There is no perimeter. We can no longer have a fence line to defend. It's everywhere. Yep. And we take that principle and we act upon it. And we start to design processes that authenticate and approve and then continuously validate and verify against them. So, talking about the specific question of, hey, what does the typical workflow look like? Well, the typical workflow looks like this. You obviously have a vision of what your implementation of Zero Trust is going to look like, or you couldn't have started in the first place. So that was kind of step one, and getting everybody on board with that vision. And that vision includes a definition of what Zero Trust means. And now you're going to sit down and you're going to start working through what are the processes and systems and equipment, assets, whatever, that my organization relies on from a technology perspective. And I kind of pause there because I can't just say my network devices or my endpoint devices or my server devices, because maybe you're a manufacturing facility and you have a lot of programmable logic controllers or PLCs out on your network, right? You have a lot of robots and automation that you have going on. We need to incorporate those things also because they're accessible and exchanging information and all that. So we need to identify all those things. We need to understand what our scope is. Then we need to break it into manageable pieces, and we need to look at each piece and say, okay, well, this is how this process works. It involves an interactive user. It involves these pieces of hardware. The user does this to authenticate and then gets access to these level resources that lasts until they log off, whatever the process is. Yeah. And then you need to go through there and you need to start saying, okay, which of these align with my Zero Trust vision and which don't? And those that don't, you then need to ask the question of how do I make them align, right? What steps do I take? And you define, and you can see we started at a point and we moved down and we branched off, and then each of those branches has branches and branches and branches. And eventually you end up with this thing that when you look at it, looks very complex, but it's highly manageable because you've defined everything. Yep. You cannot manage what you cannot measure.
Mm-hmm. That's for sure. Sure. All right. Yeah. Good way to think about it, for sure. All right. As an enterprise is putting this into place and starting to make it work, well, what are some of the access control policies that best work within a Zero Trust framework?
So one of the first things that I tell people to do is to define your types of identity, right? Because most organizations have a lot more than they think. They think of identity, so those are my users.
Yeah.
Well, no, right? You have a lot more stuff going on in your network than just users. You have services that are authenticating. You have computer accounts that are authenticating. Yep. You may have some automation devices that are authenticating, or Internet of Things devices that are authenticating or should be authenticating. You might find that you have things that are just operating and allowed to operate without authentication. Mm-hmm. So you need to understand what types of user identities do you have, and then map those to how are you going to authenticate, approve, and validate those things, okay? Then what I tell people, when it really comes down to access control policies is once you have those definitions and you understand your scope and you understand your pieces, you start to look at touch points. And so let me give you an example. I have a machine that's out on my warehouse floor because I'm a logistics company. I store products or warehouse products, and then I load them on trucks and I ship them out for different companies and do that kind of thing. So I have, workstations on the floor. I have servers in the office. I have network switches in between and all that kind of thing. Well, so I go and I look at that workstation and I say, okay, well, it's got a wireless connection, and then that wireless access point it's talking to connects to a switch, and that switch connects through 3 other intermediary switches until it touches the core switch, which then touches the switch that the server is connected to. And, I'm running an application that needs to go back and forth to that server. Well, what I find in most cases is a lot of companies have not looked deep enough into that to refine the control points. So the communication between that endpoint through all those switches I mentioned all the way to that server is wide open. So let me make a particular example. Say you need to run RDP. That's all you're doing is running remote desktop.
Yep.
Well, that's port 3389 typically. So why would you want every switch to allow port 25 SMTP communication to flow from that endpoint through those switches to that server? Doesn't make sense, does it? It's unnecessary.
Right. Yeah.
And zero trust tells us that, and zero trust in combination with principles of least privilege and other security things tells us that we should limit to only what's necessary and nothing more, right? We cannot trust that endpoint will only ever want to do RDP because it could get infected with some malware that tries to get it to operate as a rogue mail server to send out spam.
Yep.
So we can't assume that won't happen. Zero trust tells us assume nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we protect against that possibility? Well, we put in access control lists on each and every switch that says, hey, if it originated on this endpoint, only allow port 3389, right, of a specific protocol. And we can even get better. We can say that endpoint never talks to anything but that particular application server. So now not only are we going to limit it to a particular protocol or let's say a particular socket, so an IP and a port, but we're going to limit it so that endpoint has, an access control policy in place that limits it to only talk to that server. And this is where we get into that talk about convenience. A lot of conventional thinking has us thinking, but what if we want to use that endpoint for something else down the road? This will lock us out. It will, because that's what it's designed to do.
Yep.
It's designed to lock out any additional functionality. And that doesn't mean it's permanently locked out. What it means is in the future, you will have to take a conscious action to open up additional functionality. And in the current environment we're in, the current security environment, the more we can get to where we make a conscious decision about what happens rather than just reacting to what happens, the better off we will be.
Better off, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, just because some attack or connection would kick in the door, that has to constantly be verified and checked and whatnot. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure you can imagine. Somebody walks in with a USB stick that has a file on it, and they got a couple extra minutes to work on something, so they pull it up to look at it on a computer that they're not supposed to look at it on, and boom, malware is now inside your perimeter. And that's why when we talk about zero trust, we don't think of a perimeter. There is no perimeter. Every endpoint, every touch point is part of the perimeter.
Yep, every access, for sure. Indeed. Well, that segues nicely into the next question about network monitoring. Even though we don't think of it as, network endpoints and whatnot, what sort of monitoring should an enterprise put in place to ensure that the zero trust policies and procedures are indeed, being put into place?
Well, this is a great question, and this actually coincides nicely with a question that came in from Arthur about switching to ACL security that manages and is verified hop by hop, so switch by switch in the example I gave, versus just kind of managing it at the endpoint seems extreme and hard to manage. And our IT groups are already overworked and under-resourced and that kind of thing. So how do we take that on? Well, this is where automation and monitoring come into play, right? By utilizing, we can't modify what the definition of zero trust is or its importance, right? It comes down to, it says, assume no network edge, period. There's no unless after the period. It's a period. And it says, hey, constantly validate proper level of access at every touch point, period. There is no unless. And so, unfortunately, they don't give us the bandwidth to say unless, John, you're too busy today, or you have no help because everybody else on the team took vacation or whatever. It just says period. And that's what, and it says period for good reason, because the threat actors want to take advantage of every unless we would say they want to take advantage of. So that's why we don't allow those. So how do we get by that? Well, we use automation and monitoring. We put in systems. There's some great cloud-based ones. I'm a big fan of the Microsoft Azure-based cloud-based solutions with the Defender suite and privileged identity management, endpoint manager. But you can use tools from many different vendors to manage your network devices, push configs, monitor those configs to see, am I seeing activities on ports that I shouldn't be? And what you want to end up with is to where you as the IT pro that's responsible for this, you don't have to try and manage it at a granular level because you don't have the time or the resources available for that. Instead, what you want to do is you want to be able to kind of watch from on high over the entire landscape.
Yep.
And so I use my Lord of the Rings analogy here, just showing how geeky I really am.
Nice.
And so you're kind of the eye of Sauron looking over the whole thing.
Yep.
And then when you spot something unusual, when one of those monitoring tools comes up and says, hey, I'm seeing activity on a switch and switch port that I don't usually see.
Yep.
Right? That is what you then focus. Yep, and you focus on, and you make a little deep dive in and whatever.
Yep.
And what I find a lot of times we become afraid of is, if I look, I'm going to see a bunch of stuff that I don't have the capability to handle, and I'll feel guilty about that because if I see it, I have to handle it.
Yeah.
Leif, ignorance is bliss, and unfortunately, you're looking at me going, John, I know ignorance is bliss, but ignorance is also dangerous. And if our true goal is protection and evolution, whatever it is, we find it, we acknowledge it, and we fix it. And what I try and encourage people is don't be afraid. It is what it is. Find it, bring it to the light, and then engage the business to tell you how to handle that, right? You know what zero trust is. You know that you have, a dozen switches that are all wide open, and you're one person. You can't possibly get in there and make ACLs on every switch and every level.
Yeah.
And so you go to the business and you say, what do we want to do here? We can add resources. We can outsource some help, right? We can implement monitoring and monitor for altered activity and then just put ACLs in at the core switch level or that kind of thing. You find out what the organization wants you to focus on, and then they have an understanding what the risk is. You don't have to carry any guilt with you, right?
Yep.
Because you can know that you're doing what the business has decided, and you're absorbing the risk together.
Yep.
We will never, in my opinion, eliminate all risk because we're fighting. We're fighting a zero-sum game here where there's a winner and a loser.
Yep.
And the attacker wants us to be a loser, and they're better armed than us. They're better funded than us. They're in general better resourced than us.
Yeah.
And we're just not going to get to that zero risk area.
Right.
But we in IT don't have to live with the stress and sleeplessness of absorbing all that risk on our own.
Yep.
That's why we have an organization and why we should be part of a team, is because we can sit and we share that risk together.
Yep.
Right? We acknowledge that this is going to exist based on the level of resources that we have and what we can afford.
Yep.
And we believe we've We've made that choice consciously and with good information. And if it comes back to bite us, we'll deal with it together, right? And I think what a lot of IT pros think is, well, what's going to happen is if something goes south and we get penetrated, it's going to be my job. Right. It's going to be this. Not if you had those conversations.
Yeah.
And monitoring empowers those conversations, right? The more visibility you get through your monitoring tool and the more summarization you're able to get from it, because that's one thing I will tell you, when you're talking to the C-suite or those kind of stakeholders, they want the Cliff Note version of your book report.
Yeah, right, exactly. They don't want all the tech details.
Probably not even called Cliff Notes anymore, but...
I know what you're talking about, though.
You probably know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh, yeah.
We used to get those book reports in high school that you got to read this whole book and read a book report. Well, you go out and buy that little summary document that told you the high points, and then create from there. Well, executives want the Cliff Notes, and then they'll ask for more detail if they need it. So your monitoring tool needs to be able to give you the Cliff Note version,
right,
and then let you drive into the actual text of the manuscript, if you will, or the novel, and find the details where you need to find.
Right. You have to monitor all the Palantirs and then feed that to Sauron to finish that metaphor. Sounds good. All right. Well, similar to like what you say about there's no network endpoint, there's no network edge, nor are there any physical barriers really in enterprises these days. Everyone's all working everywhere, remotely and mobile. Can a zero trust framework protect and incorporate remote and mobile devices and the workers using those devices?
Absolutely, Leif, and I would say it has to.
Yeah.
These are primary drivers for why we must have zero trust architectures in our organizations, and this actually coincides with another great question that came in from Rob, where he asked about, can the same granularity apply in our cloud environments? Absolutely it can, and it must. When we talk about zero edge, let's talk about this for a minute.
Yeah.
We think about zero edge and we say, hey, there is no network edge. Well, what's that mean? That means that as far as I can see and beyond is all part of my network that I have to protect.
Yep.
And that would include on-prem, cloud, mobile,
sure,
thick workstation, thin workstation. It includes all of it, right? So wherever the activity is occurring, we have to authenticate, approve, and validate, right? Wherever it's occurring, whether it be occurring on a tablet in your local coffee shop or a virtualized desktop that's running from a cloud provider, or whether it's happening on a desktop computer that's sitting in the CEO's office. Wherever the activity is occurring, the zero trust principle has to be applied. And that's why I talked earlier about it can be daunting to get an understanding of what your scope is. What does the horizon look like? What does it include? But it's so important because otherwise, here's what happens in my experience. You start out on this adventure, and it really is an adventure. And you start to secure. You start to secure the things that are probably what you would think would be obvious. So the endpoints in the office and the servers and the network devices. And then, okay, well, I know I've got some remote workers working from home VPNs, right? They're work from home type people. Okay, we got to secure them. And you keep going and you keep finding more. And you end up disheartened because you're like, every time I think I'm getting one step forward, I end up realizing that I just took 5 steps back.
Yep.
Well, that's what happens if I tell people that, hey, we're just going to take a walk across the beach here, and I introduce them to the Sahara Desert. You could probably get where I'm going with that, right? Is that you thought you were taking a walk on a beach where it had a pretty defined start and end point, and you ended up walking across one of the biggest deserts on the planet. Now, had you known that you were about to walk across the desert, you might not have said no, but you might have prepared, and you probably would have prepared. And so, when we look out on these things, we have to look at the resources we have, the touch points we have, wherever they exist. So not only can this apply in cloud environments and mobile environments and that sort of thing, but it must. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, this really doesn't apply in a zero trust architecture, you can cry foul on that and tell them I said so, because zero trust assumes no network edge, which implies everything is included.
Yep, absolutely. Underlined and in bold type. For sure.
You got it.
Well, everyone these days, certainly, every company has people coming and going at various points. And once these policies are in place and the devices with which they're associated, how can enterprise IT add or remove users and devices from their zero trust framework?
So this is where the tool set really comes into play and shines. Okay, and so your tool set is your identity management system and architecture, your endpoint management systems and architecture, your defense mechanisms and architectures, your network infrastructure management systems and architectures. So now that I said that at a high level, let's talk about specific examples at a low level, and we'll talk about identity management. First thing, you should try and get your systems down to a single identity management system or as close as you can.
Yep.
What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, if you're using the password management, the identity management of every built-in software application you have, you are hurting yourself greatly.
Yeah.
And a perfect example of that is let's say you have a service desk management system. So for your help desk, you get a ticketing system, and it has a built-in system where you can create, accounts for your technicians and define their passwords and authenticate and everything else. And everybody's like, okay, well, I'm going to do that because it's straightforward and it's way easier than implementing it with my Active Directory. Problem is you just went and deployed a second identity management system on your network. And I want you to think about this. Do you think that company has the level of resources that Microsoft has when it comes to developing an identity management system? Probably not. Do you think that company, which bases their profit on selling you that ticket management system, puts all their money, their development money, into making sure that their identity management is highly secure and highly protected against threats and all that? Or do you think they put most of their money and resources into the product they're trying to sell, the features they're trying to sell, such as what the help desk ticket looks like and what this looks like and what that looks like? Right. And I imagine you're sitting there like a lot of our attendees are sitting there thinking to yourself, common sense tells me they're not going to throw their money there, because then they would never sell their product, because people aren't buying an identity management system, they're buying a help desk system. And the thing that I tell people when they ask me, they go, well, but that's an identity management just for that application. I'm like, yeah, but that application resides on a system that resides on your network. So you're letting them get access to something, and you're trusting, you're assuming that they can get no farther, whereas zero trust tells us assume nothing.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Assume breach. That's the way if somebody asks me for the 1 second definition of zero trust, I answer with assume breach.
Yep. Assume everything's a breach.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yep. Assume the event has already happened. You're already compromised. The attacker's already in.
Yep.
What are you going to do?
Yep.
And And I know that a lot of people are like, wow, that's a negative attitude.
Yeah, well.
And unfortunately, security is negative to some perspective, right?
I have to assume the worst.
You got to assume, because, what are you protecting against? You're protecting against the worst motives, the worst resources with, the worst intentions. And so, I'm gonna act accordingly. And, so I would never do that. Whereas if I take the extra steps of figuring out how to turn that integration in that's ticketing system to use my Active Directory, now I've said, I'm going to use this application for all the great features I bought it for, but I'm going to rely on the identity management of the system that was built for that. And the other advantage that gives you is now you only have to add or remove the user from one place, not two. Mm-hmm. And that's a very simple example. Yep. When you count the number of applications that are on your network and marketing systems and accounting systems, quality systems, whatever it may be, and all of those systems have, applications, and what if they have individual identity management and everything else, all of a sudden the number of places you could have user accounts in when somebody leaves the company that you have to remember to get in there and deal with is unmanageable. So get to one or as close to one as possible. And of course, the one that I work with most times is Active Directory. So I pretty much, when I'm speccing an application or I'm looking at it early on in the process, one of the things I look at is does it integrate with Active Directory or Azure Active Directory? Because that's what's great now is you're getting a lot of cloud-based applications, and you just ask them if they tie to Azure AD, because you can tie your on-prem AD to Azure AD. Yep. And now you end up with a single point of management. We always talk about a single pane of glass to look at things. Mm-hmm. Well, how about let's talk about a single point of management? And once you get down to that single point of management, here's another tip I recommend is let go of the control and let it go to the point of action where it should be managed. And that's a lot of words to say something that's actually pretty straightforward if I describe it. And that's, if it's being managed by the people that are closer to the situation, in my mind, that always gives you a more secure, a more robust, and a more convenient for your users experience. Yeah. And when it comes to users, that's HR, human resources. Yep. When someone joins the company, do you know about it first, or does the HR department know about it first? I've never met the company where the IT group knows somebody is being hired before HR knows somebody. Before HR, yeah. Okay. HR knows it. So if you have HR entering that teammate into a system, and most organizations have some sort of HR management system, so you tie that to your Active Directory so that when they create the user in their system, it creates the AD account and it flows through, and you define rules so that it gets, based on job description or whatever, where you can say, hey, a new quality inspector has been hired. HR enters that in and assigns a title. That creates an account in AD, and you have rules that say, since it's a quality inspector, they get access to these groups. They get added to these mailing lists, right? And it all happens automatically. And then you've tied your physical access control system to your AD. So now HR, by saying they're a quality inspector and they work in this plant, the system knows through predefined rules that means they get access to these doors, right? The parking lot, that kind of thing. And all that happens automatically without IT ever having to be involved. So what's that do for you? It frees up a whole bunch of time and worry. Yeah. And then it also, what's that do for the business? Well, it lets HR get people onboarded and that onboarded person to have a better first day experience because they don't have to wait as long for IT to be involved. And let's look at the other side of it. Somebody's let go in, let's just say, some questionable experience. Somebody is let go in a way where the company feels like this person could come back here and do some bad things, right, as a threat. what's more valuable to the company in that form is that HR, who again is going to know about that well before you do, is able to go in their system and say, this person is terminated or fired or removed, whatever.
Yeah.
They click a box, and now automatically through the system that flows, and it removes the physical access to the parking lot gate and the outer door and all that without a call ever having to be made to IT, without a ticket having to be entered and all that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know too many organizations that don't get excited about that because they're like, hey, HR is the first to know if we have a risk like this. You're letting us have HR take that risk out immediately with no delay. To me, I call that a win-win situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
A win for IT,
Yeah.
a win for HR, a win for the business.
Yep, works for everybody. Yeah. For sure. Sounds good. All right. Now, once the Zero Trust framework is running and things are cruising along, does it require any sort of updates or maintenance or ongoing attention? Or?
Absolutely. And this is unfortunate reality of 2022 and even in previous years to some degree, is that we're having to sacrifice the IT initiatives that actually support technological advancement of our companies for security causes, and with the overall goal of, or the overall understanding that by protecting the company from an extended outage of computer services, we are enhancing the technological capability of the company.
Yeah.
And that may not make sense because you're not actually changing the functions you're providing to them, but what you're saying is hey, when all these companies around you are getting taken offline for 6 weeks and can't ship to a customer and can't do things and that sort of thing, we keep you running.
Yeah.
That's a technological advantage.
Yeah.
Recent event, there was a supplier to Toyota. This is well published. This is after the war. This is all part of this cyber warfare era we're in.
Mm-hmm.
A supplier gets taken out to Toyota. So this is just some company that Toyota buys parts from that they use to build cars. That company was down for just a couple days, but it shut down. I think the number was 14 plants, 28 lines. And the ultimate result is that Toyota was not able to build 13,000 cars.
Yeah.
So if you can't build 13,000 cars, you can't sell 13,000 cars.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now Toyota, of course, is big enough where that's bad and that's annoying and it hits the bottom line. But did it result in people having to be laid off or not getting paid? Probably not.
Yeah.
But that supplier downstream, not only did they lose their ability to do all production, so there probably were people that were laid off and not getting paycheck and all that
from their company
in the short term.
Yep.
Yeah, but once they got back online, you tell me next year or 2 years down the road when Toyota goes to introduce a new model line, do you think they're going to that supplier that shut them down and caused them to lose 13,000 cars production and asking them to bid on it and giving them the inside track, or do you think they're looking for other suppliers?
Go somewhere else. Yeah, exactly.
And so that's what I mean by us keeping our organizations secure enough that they can remain in play each and every day is in 2022 a technological advantage to the organization.
Yep.
So to keep that advantage, you have to constantly be looking at what does the threat landscape look like.
Yep.
Last year in November, we were adjusting and looking at everything again from that lens of, okay, well, it's typically monetary based attacks, it's attacks that are designed for the intent of getting a monetary payday or espionage, trying to get some advantageous information, those kind of things, to now in April of 2022, our primary concern are state-sponsored warfare type attacks originating because we've sanctioned Russia and we've sanctioned their allies and that kind of thing, and they're coming at us. You hurt us, we hurt you. That's a whole different mindset. And so we have to adjust for that. And so if we're not looking at our policies, procedures, actions, decisions, and adjusting, then we're just, we're waiting to be the unlucky number.
Right.
I would much rather control my own destiny than have somebody, particularly a malware or a cyber attacker, determine my destiny for me. So I am constantly looking, adjusting, and adapting. And a lot of the products that are out there, they're evolving so frequently that you constantly have to look at their capabilities and that kind of thing. Cyber insurance policies are now requiring, many of them, a much higher compliance rate with CVEs, common vulnerability and exploits, so we should be looking at what new CVEs are published. There was a, attack recently that the Blink attack that affected a lot of devices, such as WatchGuard devices and other brand devices. And so keeping up with those things and knowing that they're out there puts you at the front of the game to where you're making informed, conscious decisions rather than just reacting to what's going on.
Right. Yep. You do not want to be the next headline. That's for sure.
Oh, sir.
Right. All right. Well, as always, as we start to wrap up here, I'd like to see if you have any final thoughts or anything you think we might have missed or anything you want to re-emphasize.
I think the best way to answer that is it looks like we've had some other great questions come in. If you want to try and handle a couple of those, I'd love to get it there.
Sounds good. Let's move right on to that. Good call. All right. Well, let's. You mentioned that question from Arthur Snyder. Let's get his question in there first, right off the top. He said switching ACL security hop by hop seems hard to manage versus endpoint workload management. How can you accomplish that?
Well, I think we actually answered Arthur and Rob's well enough. Okay. There was one that popped out to me, if you don't mind me going on, where Christian says that how can organizations start to catalog software and the entitlement identities that they should have to various software? This seems to be a large effort. Any tips for success? That's a great question and a great observation, Christian. It is big, like looking out over the Sahara Desert. The natural thought is how can I cross this? This is impossible. I can't do this. Mm-hmm. Well, first thing I want to tell you is you can do it.
Yeah.
I believe in you, and I know you believe in you, and I know your organization believes in you. You've got this. You've got it in your pocket. So don't worry about how big the horizon looks. Do just exactly what you said. Look for the angles and the tips that can bring you success. And, a couple that I've experienced is I seek first to understand as much of the horizon as I can. Yep. And then I kind of use the approach of I can't eat a 38-ounce steak in one bite, even though everyone tells me I have a big mouth. It's not that big. I have to take it a bite at a time. Yep. And so that's what I do in this approach. I will take and I'll break down to an area. I'll say, okay, what's an area I consider highest at risk? Well, I'll use that, manufacturing company again.
Yeah.
Manufacturing is probably the most core thing, because if you're not producing a part, if you're that supplier and you're not producing the part for Toyota, then you're not able to sell things. You're not able to invoice. You're not able to receive payment. You're not able to do any of those other things. So keeping the machines running are pretty important.
Yeah.
So I might focus on them first, and I might say, okay, when it comes to manufacturing, what are the key systems and applications that I'm using? Here they are.
Yeah.
And then I bring together the stakeholders. I say, who are the stakeholders in running these applications? And I sit down with them and I say, my goal is to keep you running day in and day out without operation, without stoppage. I say thanks, because that's kind of important to us, right? If we're not making parts, we're not making money. No reason for us to be here. So they say, we're on the same page there. We appreciate that. And then I say, okay, well, to do that, we're going to go on a journey together. It's going to have some bumps and some bruises and that sort of thing. But I'm going to try and help you avoid that, and I need your help in helping me avoid that. So what are the top things that have to keep running? Give me the top 5 things that absolutely, everything else, it may be important, but these 5, if any of them stop, we stop.
Yeah.
And then I take those and I look at the top 1 and I say, what are the applications involved?
Yep.
What are the identities involved? Right? How do I manage it? And you get the approach I'm taking here. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I keep using my knife and fork to cut that steak into a piece that is small enough that I can bite it and chew it and swallow it.
And prioritize all the pieces.
You got it. And guess what? Like I said when I first started my talk about it, is I know you'll be successful. I know when it comes down to it, you'll end up eating that whole steak and wondering to yourself, how the heck did I manage to eat this huge steak? And then thinking to yourself, man, this is going to be a lot of time in the gym.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Active Directory quite a bit, and working within that framework. Got a question here from a gentleman asking, how can this apply to with those of us who are stuck with a hybrid Active Directory? He put hybrid Active Directory in quotes, naturally.
Okay. So if he means hybrid Active Directory, meaning, for instance, that he has Active Directory that's synchronized with Azure Active Directory, often we call that a hybrid scenario.
Sure.
I treat that as a single point of identity management because depending on how you implemented it, you still get down to a condition where you manage it in one place and those changes show up everywhere.
Yep.
If you have some other federation, say you're federated with a different type of identity management system, and that's creating your hybrid scenario, because, let's think about that, right? Hybrid means you've got some sort of combination here that isn't just the one thing.
Right.
Try and create processes and controls around it so that you're managing it in one place and in the strongest place.
Yeah.
And then that management flows everywhere else. So if I'm federating it to 3 other directory systems, and I know that Active Directory has the most capabilities, the highest level of security, I have resources that are much more familiar with Active Directory than these other 3 systems, that sort of thing, then configure it such that you manage an Active Directory and everything else just picks it up from there in the federation. And if you're stuck with, that doesn't work because this one other system, it's from a company we acquired and they do their own management and we just have to federate between them, then do everything you can to understand that, to wrap understanding around it, and then use that understanding to wrap control and monitoring around it. Understand how those identities touch your resources and then monitor them to see, are they touching it in any unusual way? Unusual touching is bad.
In a variety of meanings. Yeah.
Got it.
Yep. Well, here's a question I think is interesting. And we talked a lot about use manufacturing examples and just about anything that's connected. This guy asks, what would you say is the biggest security threat from IoT devices, Internet of Things devices? How can we protect our organization better from those?
So, I consider the biggest threat to IoT devices being the unknown. And I'm trying to think of a good way to analogize that. It's the desert that it literally has no end. It has no definition of depth or breadth or width or whatever. And because of that, knowing what I have to protect and how I have to protect it becomes significantly more difficult.
Yeah, yeah.
And why is this? It's because IoT devices, even if they use, we'll say, what we could consider as a standard OS. So let's say it's Windows 10 IoT or Android or whatever. There are so many customizations that each manufacturer can put in those things that you might as well consider it a custom OS on every device in my mind.
That's a good way to think of it.
And that's how I protect against it, right? Is I consider it custom, and therefore it's very important that I identify where it's going to live, the things it's going to touch, and how it's going to touch them. For instance, we go back to when I talked about ACLs and points. I will put in, well, here's a great example, multifunction units, printers. I have not met an IT person that loves printers yet, and that's going into my 30-year career. And they've actually gotten worse over the years, not better. And a lot of people are like, no, you're crazy, they've gotten better. And I'm like, no, they're getting worse. You know why? Because we've added in all this other functionality, scanning and these types of things. And the vendor, it's just like I talked about earlier with the level of investment. When the vendors create the software for these things, do you think they're investing a whole lot in making sure that it's not noisy or chattering on your network, on making sure that it has proper identity management or whatever? No, they put the least amount of effort into that you've seen anywhere. And what I've found, I've gone out and plugged printers, these multifunction units, into the network, and then I do a network capture, and I'll print out that next app, and they are blasting on the network so much that, I mean, they're impacting performance of other applications on the network. And I talked to the vendor, and they're like, no, it only checks in with us once a day to give us meter reads on how many copies you've done or whatever. And I'm like, really? Because I've got the network layer capture right here that shows it's been talking on the network nonstop for the last 24 hours. And so that's what I mean by like getting at that level where I'll actually capture it, see what it's doing, and then say, you know what? This IoT device is all about, reporting the number of cars that pass in and out of the parking lot. Okay? And it does that by talking to a SQL database, and we'll say it uses some custom port, 62,000. Well, guess what? I do a capture, and I find that it's talking on a whole lot more network ports than 62,000. And I look through them, and I see, okay, well, this one it's talking to Active Directory. That makes sense because it's authenticating. So I'm going to allow that port. I'm going to allow that 62,000 port, and I'll make my list, and then I'll lock it down.
Yep.
And you're probably thinking, wow, there are way too many IoT devices to do that. Use the same approach we talked about before. Pick the ones that have the highest impact on your organization. Look at them first, and keep looking.
Prioritize
to as many as you can look at.
Yep.
And those you can get to, you've gotten to. Those you can't get to, understand you're human, you have limits. And at the end of the day, you can hold your head up high and look people in the eye and say, with the resources available, we did everything we could think of, and we leveraged every resource we could think of to get it done. And because you've communicated what you could get done and what you couldn't get done with the stakeholders and with the business, they should have there should be no surprise to them that you didn't get everything done.
Yep, indeed. All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for your input and explanations, John. We've had a great conversation here. And I want to give a huge thanks to Rubrik for sponsoring this event. And those of you in the audience, thank you very much for listening in today. We hope you've enjoyed this online event. And now, before we wrap up, I will pass it over to Victoria for some closing announcements and the raffle giveaway of our DJI Mavic Air 2 drone. Back to you, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Blake. Really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Wava, and I just want to thank you all for joining us today. A few closing announcements before we depart today. As you leave, you will be asked to take a short survey with your opinions of this event. Please share your honest opinions. Our editors read every single comment, and they help to shape our future events. And speaking of future events, we really want to thank our sponsor, Rubrik. They're sponsoring this event because they believe in this community and want to support events like these. So please show your support and appreciation by downloading their resources and visiting their site and contacting them for a demo. They actually have a demo in the Rubrik resource list to the right of your console if you want to go ahead and check that out. It's through their underwriting of these events that we can bring more summits in the future. So thank you, Rubrik. Thank you to our speakers, our fellow moderators,